I would resist calling the unilateral disengagement from Gaza ethnic cleansing, even though I fully recognize that it is what the Palestinians want. Um, but Israel has, multiple examples in which it has removed Israelis from areas like the Sinai, for example,
Yep.
in order for peace.
And even parts of the West Bank. Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, right. So to me, for me, Israel's credibility is built on that notion, right? Like Israel is willing to make hardcore sacrifices, right? We were willing to make them in 94. We were willing to make them in 99. We were willing to make them in 2001. I mean,
2007,
right.
2005, the list
Yeah,
goes on. Yep.
yeah. So I think that, but I wouldn't call it ethnic cleansing for me, because to me, ethnic cleansing has to have um, a more nefarious goal. Um, because usually ethnic cleansing, usually the means by which people are ethnically cleansed is through violence and murder, and I mean, look, Israeli troops had to use force,
Yes.
but I don't know, I just don't think I wouldn't call it the same thing.
Ethnic cleansing, it does, it's a dirty word. I'll give you
Yeah.
that. So what term can we agree on for the unilateral disengagement? Maybe evacuation of Gaza?
Even forced evacuation.
Forced evacuation. There we
Forced,
go.
yeah,
Okay.
forced evacuation, forced. I mean, look, for me, one of the greatest tragedies of 2005 and the unilateral disengagement was, I think I just heard, I'd have to research this, but I'm just gonna say, I'm gonna say there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of greenhouses.
Mhm.
I think there might have been 3,000, actually. I think that's what I just heard, that were promptly destroyed
Yep. By the
by
Palestinians.
the
Yep.
Palestinians, which to
Yep.
me is just, I mean, I don't know.
Well, the Israelis left all of that stuff behind
Right.
intact deliberately because they thought that Gaza would have a better chance to be a partner for peace if it was economically viable. And that was also the justification for the tens of millions of dollars that Israel funneled into Gaza from 2005 to 2023 when this war broke out. They, I think that the this current conflict should really call into question the logic that economic prosperity breeds peace. The idea that the pathway to peace lies through democratization and economic development. Because, I mean, Gaza democratized, and what did they do? Immediately elect terrorists. Like, Gaza
So,
has been lavished with foreign aid, and what did they do? They use it to build tunnels and their murder related infrastructure. So, I think that there has to be some other prerequisite
right.
that just simple economic aid in the form of grants and giving people, literally giving people greenhouses, that's not sufficient to make them peaceable people.
Okay. So, welcome back to Cooler Heads. I am Rabbi Scott Hausman Weiss, and this is Major General George Schwartz.
Oh, no,
So,
no, no.
I mean, Major, what was it? Major Captain, Major, what is it?
We can leave official titles out of it, and I'm not here in any kind of official capacity, but
Okay, so we'll
so
leave that out.
yeah, so I think it's cool that you brought that up because we do represent two different sides of the same coin. You know, both of us patriotic Americans, but
Yes.
Rabbi has dedicated his life to the clerical and the spiritual aspects of Judaism, while I have dedicated my entire adult life to service to the United States of America on active duty and now as an active member of the Guard. Although I must note, the opinions here are my own. They are not representative of the United States military or anything like that. I'm here talking as a friend of the rabbi and a fellow
Okay.
Jew.
Okay. That works. That works. Well, what I was going to ask, because George, part of the reason why I've we've been talking, and we've started this podcast is that you bring a depth of experience, a depth of historical knowledge, and also a depth of understanding conflict and understanding how uh, armed conflict has played itself out over American history, certainly. And what I was going to challenge you with is, can you provide our viewers with maybe a 3 minute a review? And obviously, I imagine that there's entire libraries dedicated to this subject. But why did peace building work in Germany and Japan? And why haven't we seen it work despite the billions of dollars that have been invested? Why don't you think why haven't we seen it in Gaza, and at least certainly Gaza?
Well, so that is an interesting question. The United States has given aid to over 100 countries, and of those countries, I can think of only four that have actually transitioned from being aid recipient to aid donor. Those
So
four are
4%.
Germany. Yep, at best 4%.
Not
That's
great.
Germany, Japan, South Korea, and Israel. Now, these four countries are about as culturally different from each other as it's imaginable to be. Um, but the answer that I keep coming down to on why was it successful there but not elsewhere is it must be some kind of cultural factor, some kind of cultural phenomenon that existed in those places that doesn't exist elsewhere, that enabled those places to avail themselves of aid and wean themselves off of the need for aid.
Mhm.
Uh, Sadly, I think the implication of that is saying that, oh, it's successful in these places, but not these 95% of other places for cultural reasons, is kind of the same thing as admitting that we don't know what we're doing with the way that we distribute aid.
Is is democracy a factor?
Well, I would say no, because South Korea was a military dictatorship
Hmm.
for quite a long time, for the majority of that time that it was a recipient of U.S. aid. Um, Now, I would caution that anybody who gets nostalgic for the idea of military dictatorship, consider that um, most military dictators like seize power, saying that they're like for the people and that their dictatorship is going to be somehow benevolent. But
Right.
in the history of military dictators, I can think of only two that have actually improved the quality of life of their people. One, Pak Chung-hee in South Korea, who was an oddly far-sighted investor in the future of his country. Two, Oliver Cromwell, going like 500 years back in
Wow.
history. All of the rest of them have been varying degrees of corrupt and benefited on the backs of their society.
So, all right, perhaps we're not going to solve that question, but I would argue that more than likely, this is about to say the least, the reason why those billions of dollars did not uh, turn Gaza into um, Dubai or any other place like it might have something to do with the maniacal commitment to ridding the world of Jews that comes from Hamas. I'm not going to
Yeah,
paint all Palestinians with that mindset, but that has been the driving force of so much of Hamas.
I cannot disagree. I think that once you, if you can end that ideology of hatred it's kind of problem solved. But until you do that, it doesn't matter to what degree you lavish Gaza with aid. They're going to continue to hate Jews, hate the West. Um, I'm reminded of a story that a friend of mine once told me, who she was meeting with a Palestinian somewhere in the UK, and he said that growing up on a refugee camp, he grew up hating the United States. He was taught to hate the United States, and it wasn't until he left the refugee camp and traveled the world that he came to realize that most of the aid that got to him on the refugee camp came from the United States.
Mm.
That the United States was more than any other country responsible for the benefits that he enjoyed living in that refugee camp. But as he cautioned, most of his compatriots never left the refugee camp.
Right.
So they're still stuck on that treadmill of hatred, getting fed that victimhood pap and having their frustrations channeled towards their more successful neighbor, Israel.
I had a friend in Alabama who was actually from Syria, and he was a successful photographer, but he would tell me stories about spending being in high school, and on a pretty regular basis, they would find themselves told to leave class, to leave school, and they would march them outside. And as they would walk outside, they'd be handed flags or placards and told what to yell or say. And all of it was hatred of Jews, hatred of Israel. He said, I left Syria, I got out. I never even knew what I was saying. Right? I never even knew what it was about. So yeah. All right. So what we know for sure is that dictatorships are not going to help us or help Jews. Okay.
No.
Um, let's go now to what we had discussed to just bring up, which is this question about that's really in the news right now, which is the issue behind Israel going back in to Gaza. And there's a lot of debate about that. And well, why don't you lay it out for us? What were the options you think were presented in front of the leaders of Israel?
Well, the ceasefire talks had stalled. The end of the first phase of the ceasefire had ended, and the terms that Hamas was demanding in order to continue with the ceasefire were just unacceptable. The proposition of continuing to bargain Palestinian criminals for Israeli hostages still in Hamas captivity. I suppose that always was an option, but it doesn't actually solve the problem. As we've discussed on an earlier podcast, the conditions of the ceasefire were inherently unstable. As long as Hamas still exists, still pledges to destroy Israel and kill all of the Jews, there can be no real peace with Hamas. So Israel had this choice in this unstable ceasefire between either continuing to capitulate to Hamas or resuming hostilities and trying military pressure as a way of either getting the hostages back or just ending the threat of Hamas more permanently.
I mean,
It's
look,
an awful decision to make. And
awful.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's a really tough one. And so I think we need to acknowledge the seriousness and the solemnity of a decision of that magnitude.
It's such an awful decision that you never want to wish on anybody, right? And it's been the discussion from the very beginning, from right after October 7th. I mean, there were voices who basically said we should go in guns blazing, and we're gonna have to. I dare say this: if we have to sacrifice the lives of these hostages who have already been taken, right? And thank God, other strategies were used, and a huge number of hostages were able to be returned. But it's always been this just awful, tragic decision, awful, tragic situation in which at some point you knew that Hamas will not let go of all of the hostages,
Yes,
right? And Israel can't accept Hamas remaining next door.
absolutely. I'd like to mention that just from a tactical perspective, whatever you may see in the news and in movies about these spectacular hostage rescue operations, that is extraordinarily difficult to pull off, even under the best of circumstances. And Gaza is as close to a worst case scenario as you can imagine.
Right, right. Well, they
We're lucky that we've gotten any of the hostages back at all. Um, and kudos to the IDF for their daring operations to rescue them.
well, but the majority of them came through as a result of negotiations but that came as a result of, this huge pounding.
Yep.
I mean, and it's, you know, it's, I want everyone, whoever hears me, hear it very clearly. It absolutely breaks my heart. The knowledge that there are thousands of children and women who lost their lives, whose ever fault it is, and I believe very strongly that it is Hamas's fault, because were it not for Hamas attacking on October 7th, we wouldn't have been in there. Well, Israel would not have gone in, period. But
Right.
so, there's a debate right now, there's still a debate about, about the Bebas children and, where they, like the Israeli medical examiners have made it very clear that their evidence, the evidence shows that these children were strangled.
Yep.
But then there are some who argue that, well, we don't know, or we can't trust them. We can't trust the medical examiners because they're in Israel and we haven't heard unbiased medical examiners. I don't actually care, because the only reason why these children were there was because Hamas took them,
That's right.
right? So this trauma that plays itself out, that I shouldn't say there's words, use the word play, that exists throughout Israeli society, I think is something that many people here, many people abroad, away from Israel, um, don't think about, don't want to think about. But I just want to call to mind those people who in Israel whose children are serving, who have lost children, who have lost siblings, who have lost friends. I think it's important, and you were saying this earlier in our email exchange, you've got to be able or willing to put yourself in their shoes.
Yeah. And
Right?
that includes the shoes of those who have family members and friends still in captivity, who
Mhm.
want to get their people back. Whatever you may think about the logic of the conflict, you have to extend some empathy to those people who just want their family members back and are willing to pay just an awful, awful price to do that. Um, the choice in front of Israel of continuing to negotiate with Hamas versus resuming hostilities, this is the choice between getting more hostages back and making sure no hostages get taken in the future. That's the to put it in very stark choice, what they have in front of them. And either path represents a path of sacrifice, painful sacrifice. And we really do need to acknowledge that.
Well, and of course, the Palestinian prisoners that have been freed, right, in return for the hostages.
Many of them have gone back to their murderous ways,
Right.
and we kind of expected that.
Right. But that is the, this horrible bargain that Israelis have had to recognize and appreciate. I was thinking about these protests that are taking place in Israel. Because I'm glad we're talking mostly now about Israelis. who are bearing the brunt of so much of this. You know, I don't know if it's ironic or if it's just how you would describe it, but it's amazing that the majority of people who are protesting in the streets against the resumption of violence are also the people who are being called up in the reserves, or who are related people who are being called up in the reserves. And and they will fight and they will do their duty and they will rail against the government. Because the truth is, there's a lot to rail against. And I think the power of a democracy going to war is that it is both and, right? You have to be willing to fight, and you have to be willing to speak truth to power. And I wonder what role that's played in the successes of societies that have faced incredible trauma and then have been able to overcome and build something new. I'm just thinking out off the top of my head right now, just wondering how this works. I mean, what's changed so dramatically since October 7th, 2023 is we have to ask these questions aloud in ways that, you know, it was theory that people have always been challenging Israel's right to exist.
That's right.
But I can see how, not that Israel ceases to exist, but it ceases to lose its heart. It ceases to lose its neshama, its soulfulness, because it's so beaten down.
Well, I think that the irony is that first of all, Israel is a notoriously fractious society, always has been, and I think that part of that draws from its character as a Jewish state. You know, we do not bow to hierarchy. We don't suffer
True.
that way.
That
It's
is
been,
true.
10 Jews, 11 opinions. So it should be a little wonder that,
Yeah.
Israel is notoriously fractious. But I think it's a mistake to think of that fractiousness as a weakness. It's part of
Right.
the character of democracy, and democracy in the long run um, has strengths that authoritarianism and Hamas thugocracy just cannot match. And so I would not mistake this fractiousness for like a divided and weak society. I would never do that. And I think that it's a sign that Israeli democracy is healthy. I mean, we've seen in the news a couple of reports of protests against Hamas in Gaza,
Right.
and what happened in each case.
Fascinating.
Yeah, Hamas does not tolerate freedom of speech. They dispersed those protests with gunfire. What happened to the anti-government protests in Israel? Nothing. The
Right.
Israeli police guaranteed their right to peacefully
Right.
protest in Israel.
Right.
So I think that Israeli democracy is alive and well, and this week's events show that.
Thank you for that. That's great, because it's sometimes I can get lost in the pathos that I hear from folk, Israelis who are here and Israelis who are there, and there's just a lot of pain. But you're right, that pain is not going to break them. It's whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I mean, that's probably more true in the case of Israel than anywhere else in the world. But that that idea, I wrote about that in my a recent blog, that democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom, these do not obviate bad people doing bad things.
No,
right? They don't protect us from megalomaniacs taking over if the people put them in power. But the only thing that I think really the bulwark is what you're referring to, which is this idea that the structure of society demands that these things are exposed.
that's right. That's right. And in democracy, there is always some measure of accountability. The government has to at least try to work for the benefit of the people, or the people will fire them.
Mm-hmm.
This
Right.
is so. I've heard a lot of Israelis and a lot of American Jews expressing a lot of frustration with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and this was something that we were we had communicated about before we hopped on
Sure.
this.
Sure.
And I understand that frustration, and I would say, like, hey, it's your perfect right as an Israeli citizen to be frustrated with your own government. God knows you and I have had plenty of frustrations with our own government over the years.
And that.
That being said, I thought that government comments from U.S. government officials saying, "Oh, hey, Netanyahu, he's got to go." I thought that was grotesquely inappropriate. Um, you are undermining the democratically elected head of state of a foreign ally. Why are you calling for regime change in democratic Israel before you're calling for regime change in Gaza?
Good point.
And I would also say that while it's up to the Israelis to decide the nature of their government, they're a thriving democracy. It's also the other side of that coin is that it's not really our business. We are Americans. It's we often feel a deep personal connection to whoever the prime minister of Israel is because he is, Netanyahu is arguably the most famous Jew in the world right now, even more famous than Seinfeld. It's it may be natural to feel that sort of personal connection to him, but I'd argue it's probably not that healthy because he is a foreign head of state, no more, no less. He doesn't speak for all of us. He doesn't represent us, and he isn't always going to be the president of, or I'm sorry, the prime minister of Israel.
No, no, he is not, and we will see. We'll see who's next and what comes. Well, I'm not sure, George, we had a single theme for today, but rather, I hope that what we have helped y'all consider is the real humanness of democracy and the real humanness and imperfections of societies in trying to build better societies, in trying to build a more perfect union. Um, there's a lot of pitfalls along the way. We're experiencing it, as you point out, in our own country. And this is a tough time to understand exactly where we fall and what we can trust and whom we can trust. But society, our society does have built-in strengths that I think will keep us together, will keep us solid. In Jewish tradition, we are regularly reminded of what we call the Shalshelet Kabbalah, the chain of tradition, and that we are recipients of that chain. And that's the chain of tradition that some very spiritually would describe as having begun at Mount Sinai. And that in that moment we were, we were sort of all for one and one for all, in the sense of each one of us standing at Sinai, each of us received this gift, this promise, this ethereal promise that we were born into the world and meant to be free. And we are also part of a society which requires inherent limits on our freedom in order to be part of a society. And I think about that when I think about the fundamentalists that live and breathe and around Israel. And you want to be open to societies and allow them to pursue their own ways. And I would argue to my death that the democratic principles that Israel is committed to were born in that experience in Sinai. To me, democracy is about recognizing that everyone is free, and we have to limit ourselves in order to make freedom available for others. And that's the piece that our enemies will never understand. That they're never going to get their freedom or their independence or their strength or their self-discovery or self-realization by trying to steal it from us.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks, George.
That was a heck of a conclusion, Rabbi.
Thank you. I hope that I hope the news gets better.
Oh, I do too. We all do. I pray for the safe return of the hostages, for victory for the IDF, and for calmer, happier times in our own country.
Yeah. Amen to that. All right. Be well.
Likewise.